So, ladies and gentlemen, in my last podcast on my NHL history column, I talked about Bobby Clark and his impact on Team Canada, the Flyers, and the NHL as a whole. But I think we're going to do an unofficial sequel to the Clark podcast by talking about probably the most influential player, well, on the kids anyway, and up and coming players that are still in the NHL in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, for many Toronto Maple Leaf fans, the change to the franchise from the dark years of the Ballard and Nielsen debacle and all that is when the great Wendel Clark was drafted. Now, he played in the NHL from 1985 until 2000, and he was a noted captain for Maple Leafs, and he also played in the Nordiques, Islanders, Lightning, Red Wings, and Blackhawks. But for a Maple Leaf fan, you almost remember to the day, to the moment, when he was chosen first overall in the 85 NHL entry draft by the Leafs. And a lot of media, a lot of fans, a lot of longtime followers of the NHL point to that as when the Leafs really made an advance as a franchise and led to a couple of Stanley Cup runs while he was in there. Now, Wendel Clark was a defenseman in the junior leagues, but he had an offensive style to him, a very, very rugged individual, wasn't scared to drop the gloves, wasn't scared to give the big hit. Now, he played with the ever popular Saskatoon Blades of the Western Hockey League, and he infamously kind of led Canada's gold medal team, which was quite strong in '85 at the World Junior Hockey Championships. Full of stars, but Clark was the one that really shone. Now, after he was drafted by the Leafs in a very, very dramatic announcement, the management of the Leafs, and I think it was a good decision, one of the few he made, up until Clark was drafted, they converted him to forward. Now, because he was known for his physical play and offensive mind combined with scoring prowess, he kind of combined that gritty style with the goal scoring. As well as he could score, that's how well he can fight. Now, in his rookie season, he had a really, really Gordie Howe season, if you know what that is. He had 227 minutes and penalties in his rookie year, and led the team and a lot of rookie scores with 34 goals on that campaign. Now, after the rookie season, he was named to the NHL All-Rookie team and finished third in the Calder voting. But the big setback in the early part of Clark's career, which a lot of people don't remember, he suffered a serious back injury in a game against Chicago in '87 when he was cross-checked into the crossbar of his own goal. Now, despite this injury, he rehabilitated and came back, and he became a crowd favorite for the Maple Leafs. And he kind of took Toronto away from the darkness of the Harold Ballard era and made the Leafs back into a Stanley Cup contender. And here's where the big change was. He was putting up great totals for the Leafs, both on offense and defense, and fighting all around. He was named captain of the team in the 91-92 season. Now, a lot of people believe that was the straw that Toronto needed to stir the drink because of Gilmore, Potvin, all the top players. And during the 1992-93 season, which a lot of people thought Toronto was going to be in the Stanley Cup final that year, the Leafs set a team record of wins with 44 and points with 99, and made the playoffs for the first time in 3 years. And they were loaded for game in that season because they had, again, Gilmore, Clark, Potvin, all the role players that you needed. And they were leading the Wayne Gretzky-led Kings 3-2 in Game 6 in the famous game where Gilmore took a high stick from Gretzky. In overtime, the penalty was not called, and Gretzky, of course, scored a game winner. But what is kind of ironic is that the Kings were coached by Clark's cousin, Barry Melrose, who was a great hockey mind, despite the fact he had the worst-looking mullet in probably NHL history. Now, there was two events in that series that really stood out and showed Clark's resilience. He took on Marty McSorley in a big fight in Game 1 of the series after McSorley tried to deliberately hurt Gilmore. And in Game 6, we thought he was going to be a major hero because his hat trick in the contest almost solidified that spot against the Montreal Canadiens in the final. And to a lot of Toronto fans and some members of the media, we felt that Toronto would have an advantage taking Montreal because they had more goal scorers and were more active on the power play and on the defense. A lot of teams get credit for it. Now, in that series playoff, he had 20 points with 10 goals and 10 assists. And because the Leafs had went so far and so fast, people thought, hey, we're not winning this year, the next season. Now, in the next year, Squad, he was hampered by some injuries. He only played 64 games, but he added 46 goals. And he was on a big line with Andrew Truck and Gilmore. And if you put, that was comparable to Châtelamer and Lafleur in the old Montreal Canadiens years. Now, in that season, he made it to the conference finals yet again. But he lost 4 games to 1 to the Canucks. He lost to the Rangers in the final. And, of course, Pat Quinn was leading Vancouver that year, who ended up being a future... he was a former Leaf player and a future Leaf coach. But we still don't know why this happened, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. In June 1994, for some reason, Toronto decided to shoot themselves in the foot. But Clark's value was so high, he felt that the changes we were needed. He was traded to all teams, the Quebec Nordiques, in a multiplayer deal which involved a young Mats Sundin. Now, you look at the long-term legacy of Mats Sundin. It was a great decision to trade for Mats Sundin, but to me, you could have gave other value players other than Clark for Mats Sundin. You could have traded Potvin, you could have traded Andrew Chuck or one of the young defensemen, but those two players, Gilmore and Clark, were the backbone of the squad. Now, Gilmore succeeded Clark as captain, but of course, 94-95 season was thrown to the wayside, and there was no chance for Clark to win the cup with Quebec. Now, Clark had some problems with the Nordique franchise when the Nordiques eventually became the Colorado Avalanche. He was in a contract dispute, and when the NHL returned in the 95-96 season, the disgruntled Clark was sent to the Islanders. That in a trade that was a 3-team trade, and it kind of won Colorado the cup because he was traded in a 3-week deal. Claude Lemieux went to Colorado, and Steve Thomas went to New Jersey Devils. Again, he was with the Islanders, but then again he showed up back in Toronto, and he was playing side by side with Mats Sundin. Now, the trade for Clark, again, this is part of NHL history. The Leafs traded #1 draft pick actually turned out to be Roberto Luongo, which Clark was getting added value. Can you imagine this? This is Claude Lemieux, Mats Sundin, Roberto Luongo involved with Wendel Clark. He drew value, and the people wanted him on their team. Now, in '98, he left the Leafs another time. He signed as a free agent with Tampa Bay, and he scored 28 goals in 65 games. But Clark's injuries and his gritty play was not giving him a full season. But after that, his success in Tampa Bay, he was traded to Detroit, where he finished the '99 season. Then he signed with the Blackhawks later in his career in '99, but only appeared in 13 games. Clark returned to the Maple Leafs for a third time, but his skills were so diminished. But now, what Wendel Clark does is comparable to Jean Beliveau, which a lot of people actually have major comparisons between Clark and Beliveau as an ambassador for hockey, not only Maple Leafs. He shows up in many events as a community ambassador and public relations person. He shows up in many Leaf games. He's always good to take a photo. My good friend Bo Sheaves has a very famous photo on his Facebook feed about Clark taking a picture, and he's always there for the fans of all ages. Now his number 17 has been retired by the Leafs. Actually, he was retired 11 years ago. I mean, here's what it was. It was raised to the Rafters in 2008, but only was officially retired in 2016. But the Leafs, I don't think, in my memory, had somebody wearing Wendel Clark's number. But he was very classy when the number was retired. The 11 different players that wore the number 17 were all respected during the contest. Now, on Legends Row, where Toronto is there, The latest ones had Charlie Conacher, Red Kelly, Frank Mahovlich, and Wendel. And if you go outside Air Care to Center in Toronto, it's part of their 100th anniversary legacy, and it keeps it going. The legacy is there. Like he was only selected to 2 NHL All-Star teams, and actually was inducted to the Ontario Sports Hall of Fame in 2011. But if you look at his lifetime totals, 330 goals, 1,690 penalty minutes, and in the playoffs he had 37 goals, which makes him among leaders of Toronto Maple Leaf history, because he scored most of his points in the playoffs with Toronto, including, of course, that infamous game pace in '93. But did Wendel Clark save the Toronto franchise from itself? He did, and of other factors, but he was the main factor. He was 90% of the reason why Toronto has been the success they have had. Yes, they've had down periods, but the Toronto you look at 2019 has a direct link, Mike Babcock, Austin Matthews, John Tavares, to the Wendel Clark years, because they brought the buds back. They brought back for everybody. And yes, he was traded in the Nordiques, and yes, he didn't have the success he needed. I don't think Toronto really figured it out enough that he needed Clark around. If you would have traded for Sundin with other young players or established players, especially goalies, but to give away a #1 pick later on after trading him twice, I still think to myself, the best case scenario, get this, if they wouldn't have traded Clark for Sundin, they would have kept a #1 pick, so Luongo would have been in net with Clark and Gilmore. And Gilmore was traded too. It was a weird time because people were getting traded after 2 or 3 years, like Major League Baseball. But I'll always think of Wendel Clark as a Toronto Maple Leaf, as one of the toughest players ever. He's his legacy, but he's such a hero. People that grew up in the 80s and 90s, let's say they were 5-10 years old in 1985, or 5-10 years old in the 93 season. You're 35, 36, and you're wearing a Toronto Maple Leaf hat. Why are you wearing a hat? It's not because of Dave Andreychuk. It's probably because of Doug Gilmour. But for sure, if you're a Toronto fan still, you can still see Wendel Clark beating the crap out of players that were trying to goon up Gilmour and Andreychuk. He would hold people down. The infamous fight in Madison Square Garden, not Madison Square Gardens, the old Toronto Maple Leaf Gardens, where the guy basically was trying to fight Wendel Clark. He turned him over, he held his shoulders down and started whacking him. And he basically, I could see on his lips, have you had enough? Good. He was an all-around terror, like Gordie Howe. The triple Clark was goal, assist, fight. And if Howe hadn't invented it, the Gordie Howe hat trick, Wendel Clark would have probably had seen as it. But I do remember incidents involving Hockey Night in Canada, where, Hockey Night in Canada was getting bad ratings for a while because, other than Gretzky games, Saturday night, Montreal won in '93, but the ratings were down the regular season. Well, Wendel Clark showed up, late '80s, early '90s. The ratings for Hockey Night in Canada for sure went up, and we were looking at games sometimes 4 or 5 million fans. So Bob Cole and the other announcers that used to announce Wendel Clark, it was giving added value. Everybody wanted to see Wendel Clark. People started traveling to Toronto and Montreal and Quebec City again to see Clark play. He was the draw. Like I said, a lot of people believe, I know it's a different personality, but he's kind of the Jean Beliveau he's the Jean Beliveau of Toronto Maple Leafs. And I never had a chance to talk to Jean Beliveau or Wendel Clark, but I heard in published reports he said that Clark was the type of player that, that every team would need or should need. But, it's kind of a bummer that, he never won a Stanley Cup. But if anybody was going to get an honorary name in the Stanley Cup, Clark would have it, because he did that much for the league, did that much for the Maple Leafs, for the Nordiques, and, for kids from ages 2 and 102 everywhere. So on this beautiful Saturday, where there could be another storm coming in New Brunswick, actually the 7th snowstorm we've had since early March. We got to wait for the weather to change. We wish you well. And if there's anybody out there that hasn't seen Wendel Clark in action, please go on YouTube. Either go on these fights, go on these goals. Like I said, you got the Gordie Howe hat trick, all kind of YouTube tribute. So anyway, hopes to find you well. Keep your stick in the ice. Bye.